My name is Molly, and I have a 20-year-old son, Tyler, who's currently in college. We've been saving for years for his education, giving up vacations, and making many sacrifices. We lived in the house left to us when my grandmother moved into a nursing home. It's spacious and comfortable, but not luxurious. It just feels like home for us. My husband, Andrew, works at a local hardware store, and I'm a receptionist at a doctor's office. We live a simple, no-frills life and are content with it. On Thursday afternoon, as the perfect sunset hinted at an early end to the day, Andrew's phone rang, interrupting my thoughts about an early weekend. While I was chopping carrots and mentally organizing the bills we had to pay, I heard him answer the call.
Yeah,
Mom, calm down. What's wrong? His face turned pale as he listened to the conversation. I watched him pace the room, a towel still in my hand. When he hung up, he looked shaken. It's Dad, he said, sinking into the couch like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The business went bankrupt. They lost everything, even the house. My heart sank. Oh, Andrew, that's awful. What are they going to do? They want to stay with us for a while, he said, rubbing his neck, clearly stressed. Just until they figure something out. I hesitated, thinking about our already tight budget and the disruption this could bring to our tidy lives. What did you tell them? I told them I'd talk to you first. This is your house. I can't decide without you. Andrew's parents, Edward and Dorothy, were used to a much more luxurious lifestyle than ours. Andrew, you know this house isn't exactly their style. They might feel uncomfortable, but they're my parents, and they're in trouble. I could imagine them feeling out of place here, remembering past visits when they turned their noses up at our modest lifestyle. But the thought of them being desperate enough to ask for help made me decide. All right, they can stay, but it's temporary, right? Yes, just until they get back on their feet. Andrew called them back and said, Mom, I talked it over with Molly. You can stay here for a while, but only until you find a new place. This isn't a hotel. I couldn't hear her response, but from Andrew's tight-lipped expression and his yes, Mom, I understand, reply, I could guess. He hung up the phone and let out a deep sigh. They're grateful. They'll be here next week. When the day arrived, my heart sank as I watched two large trucks pull into our driveway. Andrew was outside, trying to maintain a smile while directing traffic like a parking attendant. Edward stepped out of the first truck, grinning broadly as if he just won the lottery, and clapped Andrew on the back. It was ironic, considering they were moving into their son's house. Dorothy approached me cheerfully, a waft of perfume trailing her, and said, Sorry to impose on you like this. Forcing a smile, I glanced at the mountain of belongings being unloaded. It's fine, Dorothy. Is this everything? Oh, these are just the essentials, she said, waving a hand as if the furniture and boxes already cluttering our front yard weren't enough. The rest is in storage. I bit my tongue to avoid a premature comment, wondering what they'd left behind if this was just the essentials. Andrew caught my eye, clearly thinking the same thing. Let's get these things inside, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Edward and Dorothy were directing the movers with an air of authority, as though they were moving into a mansion, not our modest home. The movers carried in countless boxes, armchairs, and even a grandfather clock. Who needs a grandfather clock for a temporary stay? Over there, Edward directed, pointing to various spots in our living room, which was rapidly disappearing under their belongings. As the movers took a break, I pulled Andrew aside. Andrew, this is madness. They brought an entire house's worth of furniture. Where are we supposed to put all of this? Andrew rubbed his temples. I know. I'll talk to them. As the day went on, and the movers continued their work, our once cozy living room began to resemble a storage unit. Dinner that night was chaotic, as we barely managed to uncover the table from under the clutter. Edward and Dorothy seemed oblivious to the mess, chatting about their journey here. "Molly, you've got to try this wine," Edward said, opening a French bottle that probably cost more than our weekly grocery budget. "We're so grateful to you too," Dorothy said in a syrupy sweet voice. "Just until you get settled," Andrew replied, clearing his throat. "We need to talk about a few ground rules. Space is limited, so—" "Oh, don't worry about that, son," Edward interrupted, waving a hand. "We'll make it work, right, darling," he said, smiling at Dorothy, who nodded enthusiastically. I looked around at our invaded space, the piles of boxes and luxurious decorations pushing aside our modest life. They said, "We'll make it work," but I wasn't so sure. Living with Edward and Dorothy was, to put it mildly, going to take some adjustment. A few days after the move, just as I thought we were settling into some kind of routine, the kitchen became the next battleground. One night, as I prepared a simple and hearty spaghetti with homemade tomato sauce, Dorothy walked into the kitchen. She wrinkled her nose, as though she'd stepped into a barn. "What's that smell?" she asked, her tone dripping with disdain. "Dinner," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "It's spaghetti night." "Spaghetti?" she scoffed, peering over my shoulder. "Where's the meat? The fresh herbs? You're planning to serve this to us?" Hearing the commotion, Andrew approached, drying his hands with a towel. "What's the problem?" His mother turned to him with a glare that could curdle milk. "The problem, Andrew, is that we're expected to eat this," she said, pointing to the simmering pot as if it were a cauldron of poison. Taking a deep breath, I tried to keep my composure. "This is what we normally eat. We can't afford steak or elaborate meals every night." Andrew stepped between us, his face serious. "Mom, this is Molly's house. This is what we eat. If you want something else, you're welcome to cook it yourself." "Oh, I will," Dorothy replied, narrowing her eyes. "And I'll expect the necessary ingredients to be provided. I'm not used to living like this." That was enough for me. "I understand you're used to something different, but this is the best we can do. Our budget doesn't allow for luxuries." Edward, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice booming. "Well, young lady, perhaps it's time to reconsider your budget. We're not animals meant to eat scraps." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Dad, that's enough. We're doing the best we can." The room was thick with tension, and everyone seemed to shrink under the weight of it. Dorothy finally sniffed and said, "Fine. Tomorrow, I'll give you a list of what we need to eat, and you can make sure it's ready." True to her word, Dorothy handed me the list the next day. Marbled meats, fresh seafood, imported organic products. My heart sank as I read it. That night, we sat across from Edward and Dorothy at the kitchen table, the list between us. "We expect proper meals," Edward declared as though it was the most reasonable demand in the world. Andrew and I exchanged looks of disbelief. "That's not financially possible," Andrew said, his voice tired but firm. "It's simply outside our budget." Their response was swift and harsh. "What a pair of slackers," Dorothy hissed. "Can't even provide decent meals." In the end, cornered, I gave in to their demands. I began buying only the finest ingredients for them, while Andrew and I resorted to fast food to save money. A month later, I sat down to review the numbers and nearly had a heart attack. Our grocery bill had doubled, and Dorothy's luxurious baths had caused the water bill to skyrocket. Dinners had become battlegrounds, but tonight was different. Edward and Dorothy were enjoying the lavish meal they had insisted on, marbled steaks and imported fish. Meanwhile, Andrew and I sat across from them with plates of plain pasta. modest, affordable, and within our means. The disparity was no longer just on our plates, it carved a deeper chasm between us every day. As I watched them savor their extravagant meal, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "This has to stop," I said, throwing the heavy words into the air. Dorothy froze mid-bite, her fork suspended, and looked up. "What are you talking about this time? We can't keep living like this, eating separate meals every night. This is ridiculous. From now on, everyone in this house will eat the same food and live within what we can afford." Edward let out a harsh, grating laugh that set my nerves on edge. "You expect us to eat such pitiful meals?" "That's what we eat," I shot back. The smile faded from Edward's face, replaced by a sneer. Dorothy jumped in, her tone sharp and accusatory. "How cheap and lazy to make meals like this." Both of them turned to Andrew, their faces full of expectation. "You're just gonna let her talk like this in your own house?" That was the last straw. Andrew slammed his hand on the table, making the plates jump. "First of all, this is Molly's house. Show her some respect." The force of his words was palpable, and Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe you'd raise your voice at me." "At your own mother," she said, her voice trembling. Edward's anger boiled over as he stood, pointing a finger at Andrew. "Look at yourself. You've let her walk all over you, letting her dictate everything. Is this what you've become?" My heart pounded, but I stood my ground. "That's enough. From now on, there will be no more expensive steaks or seafood. Everyone will eat the same meals. All of us." Their stares were icy enough to freeze the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without a word, Edward and Dorothy left the table. Andrew and I sat back down, the heavy silence between us pressing in. He gripped my hand tightly. "I'm so sorry it's come to this." "Me too," I replied, feeling the weight of the evening settle around us. "But this was the right thing to do. We can't live like this anymore." After the dramatic dinner, things appeared calmer on the surface, but that was all it was, surface. Edward and Dorothy were quieter, but their silence carried a tension that kept me on edge. I knew they wouldn't accept the new rules without a fight. And I was right. A few days later, as I was tidying up after lunch, the doorbell rang. Drying my hands on a towel, I walked to the door. Expecting a package or a neighbor, I opened it to find a delivery driver holding a fragrant, oversized bag from one of the town's upscale restaurants. "A delivery for Ms. Molly," he said, glancing at his clipboard. I was confused. "I didn't order this." Just then, Dorothy appeared behind me, her smile a little too wide. "Oh, I did," she said. "After everything unpleasant lately, I thought we deserved a good meal." I frowned and hesitantly took the bag. "Dorothy, we talked about this. We're trying to keep our expenses down." She avoided my gaze and shrugged. "I thought that was your responsibility, dear." "My mistake." Andrew walked in from the kitchen, catching the tail end of our conversation. "What's going on?" "Your mother decided we deserved an expensive lunch," I explained. Dorothy showed no hint of regret. "It was just a little indulgence. We've been through so much." Andrew sighed deeply. "Mom, we've already had this conversation. We need to stay within our budget." Ignoring the tension, Dorothy grabbed the bag from my hands and marched toward the dining room as if everything was perfectly fine. As days passed, Dorothy and Edward's small acts of rebellion became more frequent, continually challenging the new rules we had set. It became clear that living together under such strained circumstances was unsustainable, and something had to change. Eventually, the situation forced us to confront the underlying issues head-on, leading to difficult but necessary conversations about boundaries, respect, and the realities of our finances. Andrew tightened his expression as he spoke. Mom, you promised you wouldn't do this again. Edward entered the hallway, his voice booming. What harm is a little lunch? Do you expect us to live like monks forever? I placed the bag on the entryway table, feeling the frustration boiling inside me. This isn't just about lunch. It's about every meal and every extra expense we can't afford. We've made it clear we need to stick to the budget. Dorothy's expression turned frosty. Well, if a simple meal is such a big deal, I won't get in your way next time. Andrew rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to stay calm. This isn't just about the food. It's about respecting the house rules. You can't keep acting behind our backs. The conversation dragged on for several minutes before Edward and Dorothy retreated to their room, leaving the expensive lunch untouched on the table. Andrew and I exchanged a look, silently acknowledging that this couldn't go on. I'll call the restaurant, explain the situation, and cancel any future orders placed without our agreement, I said, picking up the phone. Andrew nodded firmly, his jaw set. I'll talk to them again. This secretive behavior has to stop. The peace after the unauthorized lunch incident didn't last long. Dorothy and Edward seemed ready to explode, and the tension in the house was palpable. One evening, while I was doing the dishes, the quiet was abruptly broken. Just as I was about to ask Andrew, who had just come in from the yard looking exhausted, about his day, we heard a loud crash from the living room and both rushed in. There, we found one of the few decorations I truly cherished, a vase, shattered on the floor, with Edward standing next to it. What happened? Andrew asked, his voice controlled but tense. It slipped and fell, Edward replied, showing almost no sign of regret. Accidents happen, Edward said, but his tone was anything but apologetic. It was defiant. As Andrew crouched to pick up the broken pieces, I couldn't hold back. That vase belonged to my grandmother. It's been here longer than any of us. Edward scoffed from the doorway. It's just a vase. Get another one. That's not the point, Dorothy, I said, feeling my frustration mount. The point is respect. Something that's clearly lacking here. Oh, you want to talk about respect? Edward shot back, raising his voice. Treating us like second-class citizens. Is that what you call respect? Andrew stood up, turning to face his father. Let's not forget that you're here because of our goodwill, Dad. It doesn't feel like goodwill, Dorothy interjected sharply. It feels like we're not welcome at all. Living with Edward and Dorothy was like walking a tightrope, but one night, I finally reached my breaking point. We were sitting around the dinner table, the same table that had witnessed countless arguments, when Dorothy casually dropped her latest bombshell. Andrew, darling, I found a beautiful coat today, she said. I think I should buy it. Why don't we use Tyler's college fund, she added as if she were suggesting a minor change in coffee brands. I choked on the water I was drinking, setting my glass down hard on the table. What did you just say? I asked, my voice a mixture of disbelief and growing fury. Dorothy smiled sweetly, clearly mistaking my shock for approval. It's just money, dear. Tyler can always take out student loans. I really need a new coat. Beside me, Andrew, who had been quietly observing, slammed his fork onto the table. Mom, that's out of the question. That money is for my son's education, and it's not being used for anything else. Dorothy's face twisted into a pout. You can't even do this small thing for your own mother? This isn't a small thing, I said, feeling the last shred of my patience evaporated. It's an absolute no. Edward, who had been silent until then, erupted, his voice rising to a shout. You're being unreasonable and cruel. We're family. And then came the threats. His voice turned cold and calculating. Maybe the local paper would be interested in hearing how you treat your family. Or your bosses. How would they feel about it? Fear and anger churned in my stomach, but I knew I couldn't back down. That's enough, I shouted, rising from my chair. This is not how family behaves. You two need to find somewhere else to live. This isn't working. Dorothy burst into tears, playing the victim, while Edward continued hurling accusations and threats. Dinner ended with Edward and Dorothy storming off to their room, leaving Andrew and me in stunned silence. Once the house quieted down, I retreated to the bedroom and called my grandmother. After a few rings, she picked up, her warm, steady voice immediately soothing me. "Grandma, it's Molly," I said, my voice heavy with emotion. "What's wrong, my dear?" she asked, instantly alert. I poured out everything, the demands, the threats, and the impossible situation with Dorothy and Edward. She listened without interrupting, her gentle murmurs of acknowledgement providing a constant source of comfort. When I finished, there was a brief pause before she spoke, her tone firm. "I'm coming to stay with you for a few months." "Grandma, are you sure?" "What about the nursing home?" "Of course I'm sure. It sounds like you need me, and I'm not the kind of woman to sit idly by while my family is struggling," she declared. When Grandma arrived, it was as though a fresh breeze swept through the house. She may have moved a little slower with age, but her spirit was as fierce as ever. Edward and Dorothy visibly bristled at her sudden presence. "I'll be staying on the first floor," Grandma announced the moment she stepped through the door, dragging her suitcase behind her. "We'll need to move some things around." Edward forced a smile, clearly trying to mask his irritation. "Of course, we'll make you comfortable. Right, Dorothy?" Dorothy nodded stiffly, her eyes scanning the room, likely calculating what would need to be moved or hidden. For the first time, I felt a wave of relief. Someone was finally putting them in their place. As soon as the movers finished rearranging furniture to make space for Grandma, she called a family meeting in the living room. "Well, I've heard plenty from Molly about what's been happening here," she began, her tone cutting through any pretense of politeness. "And I'm not impressed." Edward opened his mouth to protest, but Grandma raised a hand. "Quiet. I'm not finished. This house technically still belongs to me. And while I've allowed Molly and Andrew to live here rent-free, that doesn't apply to you too." The color drained from Dorothy's face. "You're saying we have to pay rent," she stammered. "That's right. $4,000 a month," Grandma declared without hesitation. "That's outrageous," Edward shouted, rising from his chair. "We can't afford that. If you cut back on the luxuries you've been indulging in here, you should be able to manage," Grandma replied. "But we're family," Dorothy said, her voice trembling slightly. "Family doesn't exploit each other," Grandma shot back. "And given that you've been enjoying a lifestyle far beyond your contribution at the expense of my granddaughter, I think this is more than fair." Edward and Dorothy exchanged panicked glances, clearly searching for an escape, but there was none. "One more thing," Grandma continued. "If you think the rent is too high, you're free to find another place to live. Or, if you choose to stay, you'll assist me with my daily needs. I'll need help moving around, preparing meals, and ensuring I'm properly cared for." Dorothy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her usual arrogance completely gone. Edward, always so proud of his independence, looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Take some time to think it over," Grandma said, her tone softening slightly. They retreated to their room, likely to discuss their limited options. Grandma turned to us, her expression gentler now. The next morning, it was as if a switch had been flipped in Edward and Dorothy. When I walked into the kitchen, they were packing. A stack of boxes was already piled near the door. The sight felt like the physical embodiment of the months of hardship we had endured. We've decided to move out, Edward said quietly, looking up from the box he was sealing. We found a small apartment. We've imposed on you two for far too long. There was no trace of his usual arrogance. Instead, his voice carried exhaustion and a hint of regret. Dorothy stood in the corner, silently wrapping dishes. Her trembling hands betrayed her inner turmoil. Suddenly, a plate slipped from her hands, shattering loudly on the floor. Tears began streaming down her cheeks. I'm sorry. We all knew she wasn't just apologizing for the broken plate. Let's sit down, I said softly. Over some tea. The four of us gathered around the kitchen table. Andrew had heard the commotion and joined us. The heavy silence was broken, unexpectedly, by Dorothy. We were wrong about everything, she said, her voice quivering. We tried to upend your lives. Even Tyler's future. Edward grasped her hand tightly. Pride clouded my judgment. Losing everything in the bankruptcy. I thought it was shameful, so I tried to escape that reality. And in the process, I lost sight of what truly matters. I took a deep breath, carefully choosing my words as I faced the swirl of emotions within me. Sure, these past few months haven't been easy. But we're still family. We just need to understand and respect each other. Andrew placed his hand gently on my shoulder, and its warmth gave me strength. You'll have a chance to start fresh in a new place, a new life. It's not the end, it could be a beginning. Edward sighed deeply. Living in your home has taught us many things. That true luxury isn't about things, it's something you carry in your heart. That afternoon, we all worked together to help with the move. Most of the expensive furniture and decorations had already been sold, leaving behind only the essentials. The site seemed to symbolize a new chapter in their lives. As the last box was carried out, Grandma appeared in the doorway. She approached Edward and Dorothy quietly and said something unexpected. Would it be all right if I came to visit you at your new apartment now and then? Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes once more. Really, you'd do that? Sometimes, family needs to be tough, but it's not out of hate, it's out of love, Grandma said gently. 3 months later, Tyler came home during his break. That evening, we held a small celebratory party in the backyard. Edward and Dorothy brought a simple but heartfelt potato salad they had made themselves. Grandma, smiling with satisfaction, leaned over to whisper to me. Look. Sometimes, losing something helps people find what truly matters. Gazing at the flowers blossoming in the garden as the sun set, I found myself in deep reflection. Yes, these past months have been challenging. But they had taught us that true strength isn't just about fighting. It's also about forgiving, understanding, and finding the courage to build new relationships. Andrew stood next to me and asked gently, Tired? I shook my head. No. I feel hopeful. Across the yard, Tyler was sharing his dreams about college with his grandparents, while my grandma watched warmly. Occasionally, their laughter floated softly into the twilight sky. This was the beginning of our new story. It might not be perfect, but it was a story rooted in genuine love and understanding, a true family story. Sometimes, losing something helps people find what's truly important. This story isn't extraordinary. It's a journey of conflict and reconciliation with family that anyone might face. Perhaps you've had similar experiences, too. The flowers blooming in our garden continue to teach us quietly. Even after being hurt, new buds will always sprout. And those buds will bloom stronger and more beautifully than ever before. If this story touched your heart even a little, please subscribe to our channel and give it a like. It might just be a small source of courage for someone else who is struggling, doubting, and trying to move forward. Just like you.